So, Anton Schweizer is no stranger to most of us, obviously, and the R's and O's, indeed, upon hearing of your coming to Heidelberg, must have echoed back through the Atlantic, I'm sure. There are actually a number of people who can't come tonight, and I think the room would really burst if they had shown up. So, Professor Schweizer's CV is as cross and transcultural and colorful as most of our lives in this very lively field. He is professor of practice at Tulane University in New Orleans, right? New Orleans? Yeah, New Orleans. And indeed, he started his career by doing practice in panel paintings and sculpture in Munich, followed up by a later internship in a lacquer workshop in Kyoto until he had this rush, right, and had to stop doing that kind of practice. The fascination with materiality and the object is certainly one of his major characteristics, resulting in fascinating research and publications, as for example his co-edited volume and exhibition, which I brought, proudly signed by him, this one, an exhibition catalog which he wrote while he was on duty in Heidelberg, Japanische Lackkunst für Bayerns Fürsten, and it actually looks at unpublished material, and I know of specialists who traveled all the way from Japan just to see this. So I'm just passing this around. Please return because it's signed. It's very precious. After his MA in Japanese Studies, Sinology and Art History at the LMU in Munich, he joined us in 2004. He was actually the first assistant professor for Japanese art history, designed only to do Japanese art history, right? So yeah, he is a living example. And he held the position for a record of a total of almost 8 years. I think we've never had an assistant professor who was able to deal with us for so long, but we were very proud to have him, and students didn't want to let it go. Among others, he was a very indispensable editorial assistant for the catalog project Arts of Japan, the John C. Weber collection in New York, which resulted in the exhibition at the Museum of East Asian Art History, that was the original name in Berlin, in 2006. And that was preceded by an unforgettable exhibition that he had to organize that took us to New York City. Right? Yeah. Okay, we talk about that afterwards. So in Heidelberg, he was naturally infected by the transcultural virus, and so even though it was benign and resulted in a number of really extremely innovative and interesting publications, amongst which is one article published in the Ars Orientalis in 2010, co-published with Avinoam Shalem, an historian of Islamic art, on a lacquer piece that showed the Mecca Haram, right? Something nobody has ever heard before, and that's in the holding of a Jerusalem museum, I think, right? Anyway, so that's only one. And while he was in Heidelberg, he also finished his PhD, so it's possible, in 2010 on the Osaki Hachiman Shrine in Sendai and the phenomenon of lacquered architecture in Momoyama, Japan. The book will come out
in 4 weeks.
In 4 weeks. From
the index is done.
Oh wow, wow! So that's the final dot, right? Yeah. From Reimer in Berlin. Okay, but then in 2012 he exchanged Heidelberg for New York City. You know, it's not a bad choice. Stayed for 2 years with a very high profile postdoc of the Mellon Foundation. And he organized a really fantastic workshop on materiality in Japan. Again, materiality, making, breaking, and conserving works of art and architecture. And so we are so happy that you're back. Enrich us with your latest research, and please help me welcome him. We open the door because there won't be anyone else.
Good. So, thank you very much for this tremendously flattering introduction. It's wonderful to return home to Heidelberg. Heidelberg is definitely some sort of home for me. I would like to thank Professor Trede and the Institute of East Asian Art History for inviting me, and Professor Lederose and Professor Croissant also for coming. I didn't expect that. That's wonderful. Good. So, It is well known that Japanese art played a pivotal role in the formation of Western modernism. A major factor in this encounter between Europe and Japan were the so-called pictures of the floating world, or ukiyo-e. As you all know, an artistic style that was prolific in Japan from the late 17th to the late 19th centuries. Ukiyo-e reached Europe and North America in vast numbers, beginning from the second half of the 19th century, and mostly in the form of prints, woodblock prints, like this one by Kunisada. This specific print presents us with a sumptuously dressed young woman standing with bare feet next to a candle holder. A secondary picture, fan-shaped in the upper left corner, adds a tranquil garden setting. The early reception of ukiyo-e ran along a trajectory that included significant aesthetic and ideological dimensions. Aesthetic, since artists such as Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec or Aubrey Beardsley, or critiques such as the brothers Goncourt, surely would have prized in this print the self-assured and spontaneous brushwork, the woman's posture in a dynamic C-curve, and the accentuated contrasting of patterned shapes and blank space. Ideological, because Japan transported very specific meanings for Western onlookers in the 19th century. Japan appeared for many observers as quintessential of a spiritual East, humble and graceful, unspoiled by corrupting effects of industrialization, an enchanted and implicitly feminine realm replete with strange traditions. Therefore, a desirable antithesis to a postulated materialist West. Reality is, of course, much more complicated. Art historians have long since established that these woodblock prints form part of a vibrant communal culture which emerged in reaction to rigid legislation issued by a shogunal government. By now, ukiyo-e is one of the best researched genres of East Asian art at large. Scholars have assembled timelines, they have defined oeuvres of individual artists, they have questioned Eurocentric models of stylistic evolution, and profoundly extended the scope of material under investigation, most recently in readdressing a substantial corpus of pornographic material. One of the maybe most compelling fields of inquiry concerns the question of how the prints functioned as a type of media and the complex culture that produced them. Many woodblock prints contain specific references to customs and living conditions. They appropriate long-established elite iconographies. They provide encrypted comments on politics, propagate fashion ideals, construct identities of gender and social class. Today, I would like to add one more piece to this giant puzzle. I will do this by exploring space. That is, space in a physical as well as a conceptual sense. This means I will discuss the architecture and the built environment that these pictures refer to, and the social and metaphorical spaces they evoke. The reason why I do this is rooted in my conviction that we miss something important, that we cannot fully understand the messages of ukiyo-e if we disregard the dimension of space. In the following, I'm going to talk about one archetypal locale of floating world culture, namely the urban pleasure district, and the specific strategies of visualizing it. I structure my talk around the print on the wall by Kunisada and the place it represents, a specific venue in Kyoto's Shimabara district. This discussion is possible because this very venue, the Sumiya, still exists. It is an extremely rare survivor of an Ageya. Ageya were those extravagant mansions in which most of the interaction between high-ranking courtesans and their clients took place. I'm going to begin with a brief introduction to the political and historical context in which such licensed districts were established, followed by investigations into their materiality, spatial performance, and the resulting economies of gazing. At the end of this talk, I will attempt to reconcile our findings about the physical architecture and the spatial construct that was the Shimabara district with this woodblock print. The Edo period was a remarkably long and stable period in Japanese history, preceded by long and chaotic periods of inner war that lasted for almost 1.5 centuries. It brought a return to peace, public order, and sustained economic growth. While the emperor remained the ritual head of the state, de facto power lay in the hands of the Tokugawa, a family who based their own regime on the title of a supreme military generalissimo or shogun. While the imperial court continued to be in Kyoto, the shogun resided in Edo, modern Tokyo. The Tokugawa most famously installed a rigid class order inspired by a particular lineage of Neo-Confucian thought. This ideology placed the samurai on top and the merchants at bottom. Severe restrictions were imposed on everyone regarding free movement, choice of occupation, and therefore social mobility. Sumptuary laws stipulated in detail which degree of public lifestyle was appropriate and what remained forbidden for each class. For instance, an edict issued in the year 1719 stated that commoners must not build houses more than 2 stories tall. They must not possess items decorated with gold lacquer or paintings made with gold or silver leaf. Other edicts prohibited the use of silk, gauze, crepe, brocade, and embroidery for anyone below the top echelons of the samurai class. Famously, also, the Tokugawa severely curtailed and monopolized Japan's foreign relations. Since about 1639, international trade was only possible through 2 small outposts maintained by the Dutch and the Chinese in the harbor of Nagasaki. A further component of this all-embracing project to reorder society was the shogunate's policy to confine the bustling trades of theater and prostitution to separate and officially sanctioned districts. The main rationale behind this measure was control. The disruptive potential of the entertainment business should be physically separated from normative society. All entrants to a pleasure district were controlled by police. Only men were admitted and locked inside during night hours. Pleasure districts all above the Yoshibara in Edo were frequented by samurai and commoners alike, but they soon became a specific center of popular culture and a fetishized object of interest for the common townspeople. In practice, there were many other and substantially cheaper places where prostitutes offered their services, from bathhouses, tea houses in the cities to no-nonsense brothels in harbors and along the routes of overland transportation. However, we will see in a moment that sexual services constituted only one and actually minor part of the pleasure district's allure. One conceptual motive of particular note was that of a contained city apart from normative life. In Kyoto, the designated pleasure district, as you can see on this late 17th century map, was located at the southwestern fringes of the urban grid, at the foot of forested hills. Like its much more famous sister district, the Yoshibara in Edo, the Shimabara in Kyoto was of rectangular layout. It was surrounded by a wall plus a water-fill moat and had one principal gateway at the center front. And I'm not really sure if we can see this all. Can you see in the last rows? Maybe you can kind of turn off the light. A bit of light. Behind this gateway began a central main avenue that was intersected by 3 cross streets. The pleasure quarter therefore resembled a miniaturized version of the paradigmatic city plan that had been introduced from China to Japan about 900 years ago. On another level, the location of Kyoto's pleasure district at the margins of settled plains, close to a river, the river Katsura, and a chain of wooded hills, reverberated subtly with indigenous concepts. Prostitution had never been regarded as essentially despicable in Japan. Rather, it was seen as part of a realm of the extraordinary or exceptional that included, for instance, actors or storytellers, spiritual media, and occupations dealing with dead bodies. These social groups were understood to be indispensable for normative society, but they were traditionally kept separate, typically at marginal places bordering on water or forests. To visit the Shimabara meant to enter an elusive realm of otherness and simultaneously a state of temporary disentanglement from the restraints of everyday life. This notion was first and foremost communicated through architecture. Among the most iconic subjects of all pleasure districts are vistas of their main gateways. Here is the stately Great Gate of Kyoto's Shimabara district, with the mandatory willow tree that functioned as a marker of female passion. This gate itself was a label for the district as an island-like exclave from normative society. It also served, the gateway also served as the basis for a pun encoded in the popular name given by the Kyotoites to their pleasure district right after its construction, namely Shimabara. The real Shimabara is a peninsula on the western coast of Kyushu. It was the site of the last major rebellion against the Tokugawa regime in 1637-38. While modern historians have identified a much more complicated mix of motivations, the Tokugawa apparently regarded this uprising as predominantly Christian in character and blamed foreign forces for it, above all the Portuguese and the Jesuits. When the new pleasure district of Kyoto was erected in 1641, only 4 years after, some people found that the unusual gateway, and you see it's an unusual construction of two pylons left and right, that this gateway resembled that one of the rebel encampment in Shimabara, and the nickname stuck. The pun drew in particular from the fact that in Shimabara in Kyushu, as well as in Shimabara in Kyoto, a member of the same samurai family, the Itakura, had played a prominent role. Itakura Shigemasa was the chief commander of the shogunal army until he was shot dead during a frontal assault. And his brother, Itakura Shigemune, was the city magistrate of Kyoto, who was responsible for rounding up and relocating the courtesans from an older nightlife neighborhood in the city, the Rokuhara Mitsuchi. Like the defenders of the camp in Kyushu, the inhabitants of the Shimabara pleasure district were pictured, imagined, as a radically different community, always at odds with shogunal authority. The overwhelming majority of pictures of the floating world are concerned with a very small group of top-ranking courtesans. Around 1700, the seat of shogunal power was probably the largest city on earth. Edo had a population of approximately 1 million. In its pleasure district, the Yoshiwara, roughly 3,000 women were working as prostitutes in a system of outright sexual slavery. Only 7 of these 3,000 women were in the year 1700 categorized as top-level courtesans. The old imperial capital of Kyoto had much fewer registered women. A guidebook dating to the 1690s lists a total of 329 prostitutes in Shimabara, among them a stunning 13 high-ranking courtesans. Such women did not work in the corporate dorm they lived at, the Okiya, but they went out to meet their clients elsewhere in the district, and the Sumiya is such a place. Those privileged clients who were admitted had to follow firmly established rules. Although my discussion here focuses on the Shimabara and the early 19th century, I would like to use this fantastic hand scroll for its wealth of visual information. Although it depicts the Yoshiwara in Edo, and it was late in the last quarter of the 17th century, we can use it as a tool for understanding the mechanics of moving, looking, and being looked at in space. In this scene, the visitors have entered the district through the gateway. The shogunal control is indicated through these pole arms used by the police. And you see there are different types of people, simpler guys with a straw hat to conceal their probably higher ranking social identity, and people who have invested more money, so they have servants with them. The first buildings along the road, the main street, were tea houses that offered snacks, music, conversation, and sometimes sexual favors. Many visitors would be confined by their budget to strolling and watching only. Only the better off could afford to frequent one of the subsequent houses, where women were displayed like merchandise in grill shop windows as they made music or played board games. The truly sophisticated visitor would walk by, take all this in, but he would go on and then settle in one of the really distinguished establishments like the Sumiya. He would enter and right away enjoy one of the particular attractions of such high-end venues, namely big, huge open kitchens where the guests could watch how the star chefs of their times freshly prepared, complicated and fancifully decorated dinners. Some of the top-ranking houses had a reputation of offering the most deluxe cuisine of the whole country. They hired the chefs off directly from the chefs in waiting from large daimyo families. Most of the guests would then be seated in the garden view rooms of the first floor and would wait. They would consume some food and would watch entertainment to a general audience, like here a woman is dancing, other women are performing music, for instance. The few who really could afford it would then invest mind-boggling sums and would pre-order a guest room in the second floor and ask for one of the top courtesans to be sent over from her establishment. In any event, these women would let the guest wait for 1 or 2 hours, right, even if they are pre-ordered. This time would be filled with drinking, smoking tobacco, various entertainments such as listening to musicians or storytellers. The courtesan would take much time to get dressed, to do her coiffure, and then to walk from the brothel she lived in to the Ageya in a small procession together with her female supervisor, often an older courtesan, ex-courtesan, 1 or 2 child apprentices, which are courtesans in training, and typically 1 parasol or umbrella bearer and sometimes more servants surrounding them. These parades were the only regular occasion during which the top class women could be seen outside of buildings by people who did not count among the super rich. The processions were therefore a crucial part of advertising for the various courtesan houses, and they contributed a large deal to the allure of the pleasure quarters. The women would employ a specific, highly mannerist and exceedingly slow way of walking in a kind of very slow step. They would wear a kind of overcoat with particularly lavish decoration during those outings. And these garments deserve our particular attention, since textiles belong to the most expensive possessions in pre-modern Japan. Such highly elaborate costumes were usually donated by clients who sought a privileged and exclusive relationship with one of the top courtesans. You could term it the girlfriend experience. In the case of the overcoat on the left, the gold embroidery is literally centimeters thick and very, very heavy. Once in the Ageya, the courtesan would then take off the overcoat and usually uncover another stunning costume, like in this example. In this case, it is a complex indentation of picture, a willow, and text, namely characters from a Chinese poem that likens willow branches to women's hair. And in a highly suggestive manner, the female body would be wrapped in material splendor, but also in poetry and cultural erudition, so to say, and reverberate with the actual environment of the pleasure district. Remember, at the very entrance of the pleasure district, there would be a physical willow tree. The entire retinue would enter the guest room and join the already present musicians and entertainers. All would remain there for the prolonged dinner that now unfolded. The courtesan would usually take the seat of honor in front of the display niche, the display alcove, and would add an additional layer of human decoration to the landscape of interior decoration. The customer would be positioned diagonally opposite of her and would look towards this display alcove. As initial greeting, a variant of a wedding toast would be spoken, and cups of rice wine would be emptied, and the courtesan would, so to say, enter marriage for time with the client. She would never eat in front of the client, but she would always engage in spirited conversation, perform songs and dance, write poems, and sketch paintings. At the end of the evening, the retinue might withdraw to a corner of the room. The retinue even might exit the room and leave the courtesan and client alone, but usually even then, in most cases, no sex would be available for the client, since top-rank women were trained by their proprietors to extort a maximum of money from their guests. They therefore would wait at least until the third encounter, and each encounter would cost hundreds of thousands of currency. Right? At the time of departing, there was frequently an exchange of souvenirs of the evening and tokens of love. Okay, good. So let's look at actual architecture. The Ageya, the line of high-end restaurants where courtesans met their clients, is deeply embedded. So that's the Ageya. Okay, good. Opposite from the Great Gateway. The Sumiya is the only establishment of those Ageya that has survived until today in its entirety. The Sumiya, literally translating to corner house, was famous already during the Edo period, and it can be actually seen here on this kind of aerial view of the Shimabara. The Sumiya impressed already through its sheer dimensions. It spread out over almost half a block of the Ageya. And it had a facade length of more than 30 meters. And if you know that facade length in Kyoto is one of the most palpable, most visible expressions of social status, a house of 5 meters is standard, of 10 meters is already impressive, and they have 30 meters on one side, and then around the court is another 30 meters, so it's really big. It has 2,500 square meters of grounds. Right? Okay. Most of these kind of facade expanses are two-storied. Again, looking back at the sanctuary regulations, we know communists should not have two-story buildings, right? Good. The oldest part of the building, and that's a kind of ground map of the Sumiya, goes back even prior to, even before 1641, when the Shimabara was founded, because as we have heard, buildings from earlier entertainment districts were relocated, and it's something you can do in Japan. You can easily dismantle wooden structures and reassemble them in a different place. Extensions were added over the years, with major steps made in the 1680s, and then again somewhere during the early 18th century. The present state of the Sumiya was reached in the year 1787, and although there were kind of conflagrations in some portions, and they did some repairs, most of what we see today was present in 1787. Almost everything about the Sumiya's architecture was extravagant, unusual, and de jure illegal for a venue run by commoners. The entrance courtyard, coated with rare, brightly red plaster, set the tone of entering a place far removed from the ordinary. As in the hand scroll we saw a moment ago, one of the first things after this entrance courtyard, one of the first things the visitor would have seen was the kitchen. And this kitchen, of course, would be bustling with activity, would have spectacular dimensions, and would smell very, very deliciously, right? Good. The guests would usually have discarded their long swords already at the great gate, at the entrance gate, but now they would leave also their short swords and daggers in a custom-built and still existent container, chest of drawers for depositing the short swords, the wakizashi. Since samurai alone had the privilege to carry 2 swords, the abandoning of the weapons would blur social distinctions. Everybody would be the same in this building. Right? The visitor would then be asked to take a seat in one of the rooms facing the sizable garden. That's the biggest room. Notably this one, the Chamber of the Pine, a huge dashiki room with capacity for 60 to 70 people, really big. The paintings on walls and sliding doors cunningly overstepped sanctuary regulations in using gold leaf, as well as using this subject. These are phoenixes, whole birds, settling down on paulownia trees. This subject, based on a Chinese legend, evokes the reign of a sage ruler. The subject matter was widely used by the Tokugawa and their vassals for reception rooms and for other highly formal contexts. As evidenced by numerous depictions in ukiyo-e, it was obviously also a stock item for the decoration of pleasure districts. And I assume that this was exactly for the subject's close association with elite art that enabled bold appropriations by wealthy commoner patrons. The garden that was visible from this chamber of the pine was and is famous for its giant pine tree, named the reclining dragon pine. This is not the original tree, this was replanted in the Taisho era, but until Taisho, the original 18th century tree was standing there. The tree's branches spread out over such an enormous area that they have to be supported by a system of scaffold-like posts. And many short poems composed during the Edo period either play with the idea of this tree being a dragon, or with this tree actually evoking an entire landscape of wooded hills that you can see with one gaze in this artificial garden. This garden also contained 2 tea huts where the visitors could enjoy leisure time until the pre-ordered courtesan finally would arrive. So this is a very nice and very pleasant setting, but the true sensation of the Sumiya were the 9 large guest rooms in the 2nd floor, each one with a completely different theme and decorative program. Arguably the most extravagant of these guest rooms is the Chamber of Mother of Pearl. It takes its name from the sumptuous decoration with delicately cut pieces of abalone shell. So in German this is the Napfmuschel, right? So this is abalone. Those abalone shell pieces are inlaid to extensive surfaces of the interior. The display alcove where the hanging scroll here is suspended and the built-in closet next to it have the filling panels coated with black lacquer. The inlay decoration represents at the bottom left here flowers and birds of the 4 seasons, and the large doors of the closet to the right represent a Chinese mountain scenery with a cluster of lofty buildings. In front of those buildings, a group of literati and their boy attendants while away time with cultured pursuits. The closet is of very unusual construction, and I hope you see it because this is not my picture. I'm not allowed to put pictures in there, but I think it's not so bad. This closet is very unusual. It has in its upper part a window-like opening, a cusped window here. Through this window one can see a huge copper signet, a big seal of this size actually made from copper, in a fanciful style which a Chinese literatus might have used, and it's affixed there permanently on the rear wall. The employment of eccentric shapes and techniques continues on the chamber's other walls. Various types of fan-shaped windows are set into the transom area of the wall above the actual windows. And again, something very unusual is encountered. While white or beige plaster is common in Japanese architecture, here a specific variety of inorganic soil was used to produce a highly unusual bluish, grayish, greenish tone. Also here, mother of pearl intarsia are embedded, this time in form of geometric ornamentation. Similar ornaments turn up also in the handles of the sliding doors here. Here executed in colorful cloisonné enamel. the curly window shape, and let's jump back here, this curly window shape. It's repeated at the wall to the left of this display alcove here as an actual window that grants a view down on the main garden. The cuspid window was in Japan since long closely associated with continental styles. So it comes up in Zen style architecture and is always experienced as something that's non-native actually in architecture. The same is true about cloisonné as a technique and the very technique of mother of pearl inlay, particular if mother of pearl is inlaid to lacquer. This lacquer inlay technique was actually first made in Korea, then spread to the Ryukyu Islands and some regions of southern China. From the early 17th century on, such imports were copied in Japan and primarily employed for very small scale exoticizing objects such as this small medicine container in inro, which was worn by men suspended from the belt. Chinese luxury imports and their Japanese imitations, as we all know, were characteristic display items for formal reception rooms. The unfamiliar blue-gray plaster has virtually no precedent in Japan before the Sumiya. In my view, it may have evoked the appearance of slate or tuff. This is typical materials for Chinese inkstones. Interestingly, the mother of pearl room was never comprehensively renewed, even during the subsequent campaigns of repair and extension at the Sumiya. Likely, the slightly worn appearance of the walls was received as desirable patina that matched well the aesthetics of rare small-scale collectibles. And I believe that the extensive application of these immensely laborious and costly materials not only conveyed expensive high investments and cultural capital coming from China, but they also induced an air of surreal irreality, the notion of physically entering something that is not experienced in normative contexts. The idea of entering a gigantically blown up collector's item. This fantastic element was further intensified by the highly iridescent abalone shells, which provided not only an element of oscillating polychromy, but they must have seemed animate under candlelight. The interior space and the party that was hosted in it were transferred into a fantastic realm of imagined Chineseness. This mental relocation extended beyond the confines of the single guest room and lent a subtly outlandish air to the whole of the Sumiya, namely looking out on the garden through the cuspid window here. So here, the artificial scenery around the famous pine tree became framed in a Chinese gaze as well. And contrary-wise, the second floor Chinese window could be imagined by those amusing themselves outside in the garden as belonging to a pavilion-like structure, even if it is not, it's just the second floor of an ordinary Ageya building, right? Good. So it could be imagined as belonging to a pavilion-like structure, as is suggested in this guidebook illustration from the Miyako Rinzen Meishutsu-e. These dialectics of gazing in and out, and of framing gazes, and of subtly influencing the way something is perceived, they turn up in numerous other details of the Sumiya, most pervasively in the next room, the chamber of the bamboo blinds. The painted decoration of the chamber of the bamboo blinds is one of the oldest of the Sumiya's guest rooms. It dates back to the probably second half of the 17th century. One enters the room through a curtain-like blind here, made from thinly split bamboo, misu or sudare, right? The display alcove next to the entrance is framed by a huge and gnarly piece of tropical wood imported from Southeast Asia that adds another bit to the pervasive otherness of the Sumiya. Once inside the room, the visitor realizes that the sliding doors at both side walls are furnished with illusionistic paintings of exactly the same kind of bamboo blinds, or misu, faithfully mimicking the real one at the entrance to the very point of the silken tassels striped in red, white, and blue. So that's a real Sudare, and those are the painted ones. Right? These bamboo blinds bear, according to my opinion, crucial significance. First of all, such blinds were most typically used in architectural styles specific to aristocratic residences. They therefore afforded the chamber with a strong air of elite culture. Misu blinds were typically attached to the circumferential walls of a building. Their presence on the painted walls thus implies an opposition of inside and outside. The merrymaking party is metaphorically seated in the interior of a lofty mansion and surrounded by an exterior scenery, likely a well-tended garden, which we don't see. The imaginary bamboo blinds are rolled up halfway and thus grant a view of undefined beige expanses peppered with golden flakes. It is in this function of articulating a threshold between man-made and natural space that the prop of those bamboo blinds turns up on this slightly earlier pair of folding screens in the Fleer collection. The most compelling aspect of the tremblay bamboo blinds lies, however, in the referencing of a specific and very well-known painterly subject. The bamboo blind is closely associated with an episode, where is Professor Croissant, episode from the famous 11th century novel, The Tale of Genji. In the tale, one of the main male characters, Prince Genji's nephew Kashiwagi, catches a casual and inherently indecent glimpse of Genji's young wife, the third princess, on Sumiya. This first look at the seductive young woman becomes the beginning of an illegitimate and for several characters tormenting love affair. Kashiwagi can peek at the princess because her pet cat becomes entangled with its leash, and the princess approaches the semi-transparent bamboo blinds, which she otherwise would or should not have done. The reception of this episode was subject to profound changes over time. The role of the princess shifted from the passive victim of intrusive male gaze to a lascivious and sexually aggressive woman. In the latter sense, it is frequently depicted and alluded to in pictures of the floating world, like here. That the wall paintings of the room of the bamboo blinds were retained despite repeated campaigns of altering and renewing attests to the fact that the motif continued to function in newly developing visual regimes. Over the 18th century, there was an ever-growing interest in optical phenomena and the pictorial exploration of visual effects. A particular point of fascination were moments of mirroring, of semi-transparence, of weather and lighting conditions. Also, there was an ever-growing interest in the act of seeing and gazing itself. The idea to catch an essentially inappropriate glimpse of like here, of an otherwise restricted space can be called a leitmotif of the ukiyo-e. The wall paintings at the Sumiya play with these standard motifs of contemporary visual culture. The illusionistic opening up of the interior blurs the distinction between reality and fiction, and it introduces an unexpected twist to the experience of a luxurious interior space. But more than that, the erotic charging adds a pervasive, frisky tension to the visitor's experience. This tension involves and engages the presupposed male audience. In conventional usage, the male voyeur is always positioned at the exterior or at the border of a building, and he gazes at the woman within the concealed interior. In the Sumiya, this configuration has been turned around. The male guest now has crossed the barrier of the misu blinds and has now entered the intimate female space. He joins the company of the courtesans and maybe himself becomes part of those who are gazed at from outside. A final detail amplifies and perpetuates the experience of the Sumiya's chamber of the bamboo blinds. In a distinct rear section of the room, the background color behind the painted misu changes to dark blue, suggesting a shift to nighttime. In this room, it seems time stands still, and the party continues day and night. A last room that I would like to briefly discuss continues the strategies of directing the visitor's gaze and inducing a surreal atmosphere through clever visual devices. It introduces, however, further aspects that reflect the history of the Sumiya, its guests, and the cultural practices that were performed here. The Sumiya was not only the site of erotic escapades and sophisticated culinary orgies, but also a frequent venue for meetings of poetic associations. Banquets of any sort often involve the production of poetry, calligraphy, and painting. Most of the ad hoc and impromptu works were distributed as tokens among the members of the party, but some obviously remained in the Sumiya. It was customary that the client, in addition to the already outrageous costs, individually tipped the members of the courtesans' retinue and the operator of the Ageya. This was sometimes done in kind. One group of paintings, all executed on fan-shaped sheets of paper, was used to create one more themed room, the Chamber of the Fans. The walls are furnished with huge scenes from the Tale of Genji, painted in a somewhat Tosa-derived style on sumptuous expanses of gold. Instead of a display niche, there is an alcove holding a lectern and other implements used for joruri storytelling. The Chamber of the Fans takes its name from the 58 large fan leaves that are pasted to its ceiling. The fans are executed in a variety of styles, both so-called Japanese and Chinese, and many of the painters can be identified. The one really prominent one is Kishiganku. So the basic idea for this arrangement is derived from the common practice of mounting fan leaves on folding screens in order to facilitate their handling, preservation, and display. The decision to affix fans to a ceiling was, however, according to anything I know, highly unconventional. The fans are configured in what is termed chirashi. That means it's an ostensibly incidental arrangement, suggesting that the fans are floating in the world or are just kind of thrown up and form a big cloud of fans. This topsy-turvy arrangement means that the seated beholder is forced to lean back, turn, twist his neck in order to figure out the individual subject styles and the inscriptions. In the emphasis of variety and creative invention, the fan paintings clearly evoke the poetry gatherings that had been hosted in the Sumiya so far and provided an inspiring setting for gatherings to follow. Together with the Genji scenes on the walls, the fans at the ceiling provided what might be termed conversation pieces for the assembled audience, and during sessions of joruri storytelling or poetry production, they provided visual anchors that would have generated fruitful correspondences between ancient elite and contemporary commoner cultures. As with the mother of pearl room, I believe that the form of decoration and presentation in the Chamber of the Fans incorporated a bewildering and excitingly surreal element. The art historian Timon Screech has shown that what he calls the Western scientific gaze was set in motion primarily through Western prints, books, and specimens of technology, such as telescopes, eyeglasses, microscopes, and optical viewing devices. One such viewing device, or Volgarr Scope, is depicted on this print. It consists of a convex lens through which the beholder looks on a tilted mirror. That's a tilted mirror. A picture positioned under this contraption would appear reverse and have a curious effect of distortion and spatial depth comparable to a fisheye lens. This effect was particularly strong in pictures that provided a clear central perspective and extreme recess, like in this example. Central perspective, semi-transparent materials, partially obstructed pictorial fields, distorted shapes, and all sorts of intrusive gazing with or without optical devices. They are ubiquitous in pictures of the floating world, as you can see here. So this is a kind of spyglass, and this is what they see on the next downside. Right? The urban pleasure district, with one word, was an utterly improbable place. The happy few who had the means to book a courtesan of top rank for an evening at one of those supreme establishments such as the Sumiya, they entered an environment where virtually everything was different from normative society. The usual class barriers were suspended. All visitors here met as fellow connoisseurs of women, food, painting and poetry. The women whom they encountered blended into those fantasies. They seemed to be always charming, never eating, dressed like princesses, radiating cultural refinement and sexual availability. Spatial construction and architectural design played a crucial role in this fiction. The district was experienced as a confined realm of otherness. Establishments such as the Sumiya resembled lofty daimyo mansions, with their own famous sites, local specialties, and history. The interiors were luxurious to a degree far beyond the permissible according to the sanctuary regulations. The themed rooms upstairs were highly diversified and designed in a way that systematically thwarted expectation. The clients would find fan paintings pasted on the ceiling. They could enjoy the idea to enter this fictional space of spite at women of classical literature, or they could even enter a hilarious architectural interior like the room, the chamber of the Mother of Pearl, that seemed to be a blown-up collector's item made of lacquer inlaid with Mother of Pearl. Significantly, all these attractions were known to the cognoscenti, even if they had never entered a certain Ageya. Guidebooks such as the aforementioned Miyakorinsen Meishōzue pointed out the main points of interest for each of the famous houses. In the here shown is illustration of another guidebook, the Hitome Sengen. We can discover the show kitchen, the chamber of the bamboo blinds, with miniaturized version of those bamboo blinds, and here. The chamber of Mother of Pearl, the garden front chamber of the pine, and the reclining dragon pine itself. Where is the dragon pine? There's something missing here. Okay, good. Now let us attempt to reconcile these physical and metaphorical spaces with Kunisada's woodblock print from which we entered the discussion in the very beginning. The woman shown in it is designated as a tayu, a top-rank courtesan, one of the 13 or so in the Shimabara. The woman's carefree attitude, the voyeuristic display of her bare feet, and the bright red crepe undergarments, as well as the fact that she holds a bundle of absorbent paper in her hands, as it was widely used for personal hygiene, this gives clear evidence that we are intruders to an amorous meeting. Most obviously, this print would have conjured up in the minds of its Japanese audience a strong wave of sensual experience, not only triggered by the eroticizing content, but also based on the evocative power of the chromatic and haptic qualities of the depicted materials. The rendering of hairpins in yellow with a red contour line would have pointed to polished tortoise shell. The rendering of the textiles in multicolor and relief print would have communicated the opulence of gold thread embroidery, of brocade and silk. What is not depicted here, but would have equally figured as part of a full understanding, are the notions of the pleasure district as an insular space beyond everyday experience, and the Ageya as a quintessential locus of non-normativity, where time, space, and identities warp and oscillate. Right? The courtesan's upper garment displays a design of lanterns that has a decidedly outlandish flavor. These lanterns are actually of a type richly ornamented with pendants, so that's the lantern, and those are pendants, and pearl strings. And this exact type of lanterns was favored in China for the Lantern Festival. That's a somewhat more ancient, somewhat older depiction. This referencing of China would have been known from Ming Dynasty printed books that were amply distributed in Japan and also reprinted. This referencing of China is significant as it is not only highlighting refined continental culture, but also it manifests an archetypal other, not in the first sense a specific country of China, but rather a more or less fictional culture and country of foreignness. Above all, I believe those lanterns induce a quality that we have amply encountered in the architecture of the Sumiya, and this is the confusing and delightfully ambiguous blurring of categories. The lit candle in this print tells us that it is night. Conforming to conventions of the so-called indigenous painterly style, Yamato-e, which is a basis for ukiyo-e, the background of the woman in the print is left white, but we know that it's night because there is a candle, right? No further spatial indication is given. Instead, the black night sky and a very dense array of specific visual information, the lanterns, are manifested in the woman's garment. In other words, the courtesan, clearly the principal subject, is represented with much less attention to, if you want, naturalism as the costume. Right? This ambiguity is further complicated through the fan-shaped inset picture in the corner that shows a daytime scene set at the Sumiya's garden. The inset picture purports to be a fan leaf that has been pasted onto the main image, the main picture. Yet it actually is furnished with much more notion of naturalism. It has a blue sky, and it could be equally understood as a window into the garden, as they actually were in the Sumiya. If you know the Mother of Pearl room, then you would know that there are fan-shaped windows. The ambiguous and confusing aspect is that this window seems to be cut out of the blank void, which is an empty background. So what my argument is that there is this delightful blurring and playing with expectations and viewing conventions. Below this inset picture, a prose inscription recounts an anecdote around the famous Heian period aristocrat Agiwara no Nagihira. Nagihira, one of the most celebrated poets of Japanese history, was often regarded as the supreme exponent of court culture. His mention re-emphasizes the inherent legacy of the very place this courtesan is based at, namely Kyoto, the heart of Japan's cultural production and seat of the imperial institution. Lastly, and most clearly, the pleasure district's pervasive ambiguity and fundamental configuration through space are insinuated too in the way the title of this print is written. The title reads Ukiyo Meisho Zu-e, or Illustrated Famous Places of the Floating World. It's the serious title, right? The writing uses, however, other characters than usual. The word for famous place, meisho, is usually written with two characters, famous places. Here it is written with three different characters. While the pronunciation stays the same, the meaning is altered to famous outlandish women. Right? This alternate writing is not just a shallow pun. The courtesan in the main picture is accompanied by the small fan leaf in the upper left corner. It shows the Sumiya's celebrated pine tree. Through this mitate, which is a visual textual juxtaposition, the woman is declared a living embodiment of the very locale where she offers her services. In other words, the courtesan becomes herself a famous sight in the greater landscape of the pleasure quarter and enters a continuous back and forth exchange of qualities with the architectural frame she inhabits. In this small inset picture, a tiny customer gazes from the veranda at the garden. It is a smirky mirror image of ourselves staring at the landmark courtesan in the main image. And similar to the way in which we steal a glimpse of the girls tete-a-tete in one of the Sumiya's themed rooms. We peek at the man on the veranda secretly from behind a windscreen here. So he does not know that we are looking at him. As we watch him watching. The unattainability of this fairyland for 99% of the populace of Japan only enhanced its allure. The pictures of the floating world catered to the insatiable curiosity of those who had to remain outside of these manifest fairylands. This glittering and confusing district, these chambers of the Sumiya, part of an island realm of pleasure, these are the spaces we always have to think with the pictures to fully understand. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a beautifully crafted lecture that has a beginning and an end and so much in between. I have a host of questions, but I would defer to the public, or the audience rather, if anybody would like to start. There's an urgent question? No. Okay. So somehow the Ageya really reminded me of love hotels today, right?
Yeah.
The way that they kind of give an outlandish appearance to it, right?
That would be a fascinating next topic.
Yes, but I wonder whether it's possible to enter them, or is this a set of photographs?
No, it's possible to enter them. The thing is, this is one of the highlights of Kyoto. You have to pre-order, you have to speak Japanese. The groups are limited to, I think, 6 people. It's run by a foundation. One of the reasons why this actually survived is that right-wing police forces in the Genji and Taisho in particular had this as a kind of club headquarters, and in one of the rooms you see kind of cuts out of the main beams of the tokonoma, where they practice sword fencing and do completely random probably. But in the end, this survived. So this is one of the reasons. One can go there. It's not so easy to find, but you should see it.
Okay, let's do that for our next field trip. In listening to Professor Stavros's lecture, I wonder why the southeast was chosen, was chosen as the site where the Sumiya was allowed to be built. That's one thing. Is there any geomantic or any other kind of reference that we can hook up to? And another second question is the trompe-l'œil of these tsudabe that you showed. You showed beautifully, you know, the fascination with ocular games and telescopes and so forth. But I wonder whether there's not also a connection to Chinese prints and paintings. Because we've seen paintings exactly in the 18th century, I think in the palace, imperial palace in the inside, where there are trompe-l'œil depictions. And because this is so Chinese and outlandish, I just wondered whether there's any connection there. You don't have to answer these questions now unless they are if they're pressing other questions from the audience at the moment. Okay, well then.
Okay, so that's a wonderful comment. I looked a little bit into Chinese material, and this is one of the big topics I want to clarify. What is very obviously is that this kind of looking around, so not only the kaimani, but also the looking around folding screens is something that is prefigured palpably in Chinese woodblock printed books, right? Exactly. And I think also Wu Gong has written about this to some extent. So this would make absolutely sense. I don't think that this is something that's mutually exclusive. So this absolutely, everything in Japan around this time is polysemic. So you can read it in this way or in that way, and it's very malleable, right? What was the other question?
The southwest.
The southwest. That's a good question. I didn't hear you talk. One thing that also in terms of my other interest in daimyo architecture, it has been said for a long time that geomantics is basically dead in the 17th, 18th centuries, and I don't think this is true. I think there is much more flexibility. So in many instances one can see that the north-south axis is not so dominant anymore and cities can be turned around. So I work on Sendai, for instance. It's very similar to the geomantics of Kyoto, but it's actually turned 90 degrees. Why in the southwest? Well, the Yoshiwara is in the northeast. So this might be something that's one of the flexible parts, so it's nothing that concerns people so much. Nijo Castle is also oriented, if you take the entrance, the entrance is on the east, so it's also oriented towards the east, maybe towards Edo, right? And
I think the salient element, if I may say so, is the marginality. You know, do we know if it's inside or outside of the former existence of the Odoi wall?
it's outside.
It's outside. I
It's
think
outside.
that's the salient feature.
Yeah.
Northeast, southwest
Doesn't matter.
is less important than the fact that it's outside of probably what was defined as Rakuchu. I think that might be the most important thing.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
And this might be also one of the motivations behind relocating it from the Rokuhara Mitsuchi, because this grew, the city grew over this district, and then they wanted to relocate it to a place that's farther away. Right? There is this wonderful, I don't know if you will probably know it, this wonderful essay by Tim Screech about the journey to the Yoshiwara along the river with the many stations in between. That's something one would have to figure out in Kyoto, so I didn't look into that very much. It seems to be much closer, there's no river involved, no barks that you would embark in, and you know something about this?
No, I think that would be interesting to look at.
Yeah.
I think the distance was real though. It wasn't quite the journey of Yoshiwara, but there's a lot of farmland there. It wasn't as close as the map suggests.
Yeah, yeah.
It seems going to be a 20-minute walk from the edge of town, so to speak.
Yeah. And it's also mostly a conceptual journey, so it's not so much of how long, but how you walk and travel there.
Right.
You walk only. I was, excuse me, thank you very much for this very stimulating talk. I have many questions, but I will not ask you. One thing, just to connect with the last thing, how did people go there? I have been once in Sumiya, this is already 50 years ago, maybe. But I remember it was a very, very long way to get there. And did the visitors in the Edo period use anything besides their feet to get there? I mean, you never see it. A vehicle or a horse or something. How did they make the journey?
Conjecturing from the Yoshiwara, and this is probably the wrong approach, but conjecturing sedan chairs, probably.
Yeah, but they are never illustrated or depicted.
Not inside, maybe, but outside.
Yeah. Do you remember any example of ukiyo-e prints where you can imagine how this chair would have looked like? I don't.
I know it was depictions of sedan chairs from Edo.
Are there?
Yeah. So usually it's carried by two people, one pole, and then you can also put a mat on top of it. So if it's raining or so this comes up in the Tokaido
Yeah, this is 19th
something.
century. I
Yeah.
wonder if it is.
I assume that the licensed district itself would have been a walking thing, so I think we would have disembarked at the very entrance. Right.
Well, my other question is you called your talk Island of Pleasure. What do you think about the Chinese connection in the story of the Island of Woman?
The island of the women, this is... Yeah.
So, I mean, what mean the allusions to China for the concept of the courtesan? Is she supposed to behave like a Chinese woman? Is she maybe the ideal or more ideal than a Chinese woman? I mean, this touches on problems of sexuality and
That's something that and this is a wonderful question actually. I have no answer actually, but this is something I'm kind of torn for a long time. If actually the dress code of courtesans in the Edo period has some Chinese elements, so the kind of tucked up hair in those fanciful hairdresses, this is something that comes with the 18th century. And so I don't have any proofs, this is completely speculating, but so usually aristocratic women, also samurai women, have open long hair, and to have the hair tucked up is usually something you have to do if you work, because the hair gets in your way all the time. So to have a ponytail or something that's very plain is low class. To have something that's elaborate and tacked up and many kind of cushy and everything, that's something that would kind of require a lot of research with the pictorial, visual, and also textual material.
Yeah.
Might be interesting. Maybe this is a kind of fantasy of Chineseness. I don't know.
It would fit well into
Would fit
your
well,
interpretation
yeah.
anyway. Yeah.
More questions? The students are so quiet.
Yes. Come on. What is the connection between the Shimabara and the Kanazawa pleasure district? Because that's the only one I've ever been to, which was similarly outrageously luxurious.
In Kanazawa?
Kanazawa.
Yeah.
Kanazawa. So Kyoto, right?
So the three big ones are Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, and there is this saying that the cuisine is best in Osaka, of course, and the women are prettiest and most witty in Edo, and in Kyoto there's the aristocratic, dignified style. But there are hundreds of yukaku, of course, and I've been to the pleasure district of Hiroshima, which was actually it's Tsukushima. So there you have the island, and you have to go over there, and there are small shrines that have lanterns dedicated by high-ranking courtesans, and all the signatures are written there. And so there's a wealth of material. At the Sumiya, they have an archival collection, and I have not been able to touch a handle yet. There are samples of handwriting of all courtesans who have worked there, right? Framed and kind of pasted on, supports interesting material. So,
Okay.
next book, right? So it's somewhere.
Man, right, it was very fascinating, but one of the things that caught my attention the most was your emphasis of this sort of the breakdown, the non-existence of status rules and traditional, the de jure kind of fell apart once people stepped inside. But I can't help, when I look at the sumptuousness, the level of wealth involved, and the cost that must have been involved, the clientele must have had one thing in common, that's wealth, that's extreme elitism. Do we know anything about a sense of shared identity among the regular clientele? That's a difficult question.
That's a difficult one, and
because you have some samurai, you've got some merchants, you've got who's going to this?
a lot of artists actually.
Really?
So not only the fan paintings in this room of the fans, but we have works by Yosabu-san who were obviously given there, so not acquired. So and we have one Maruyama Okyo, that's a wall painting, and we have standing screens at Zabyo. And so they're...
Are they buying their way in?
Yeah, exactly. In exchange for
yeah,
money, for cash.
I believe
Donate their paintings.
I believe they were invited probably by rich patrons, and then were kind of paying back the debts with giving something, and probably part of it went to the Sumiya. That's my guess. That's interesting.
So you have artisans who are presumably not extraordinarily wealthy, yet gifted, buying their way in, right?
That's my assumption, yeah. And of course, Maruyama Okyo has a kind of star status, of course. So he is probably a guest he wouldn't have sent away even if he was true. Going back to your comment, of course, there are instantly new hierarchies. Yeah.
That's
It's my point is that this kind of status hierarchy of the Tokugawa shogunate is kind of disbanded. So no samurai and no commoners anymore. And of course, then you have wealth, and of course you have people who can show everything they have by going there and by hosting the shops.
So wealth being a leveling factor.
Yeah, it's of course the leveling factor. The interesting thing is that those textile equipments, like in elite culture, this is interesting. As soon as you get hold of any sorts of financial records, so textiles are always the most expensive stuff, and it decays so quickly, and it fades out, and they didn't have technologies of washing. So usually, if you sweat into something and then it's just sweaty, I know in the Tokugawa Rinnekai they have those kind of paper folded things where you keep the threads because they completely disassembled the kimono, and then you wash them and then you re-sew them with the same thread. And so that's interesting, and of course you can do this 5 times and then you probably give it to a temple and they would cut it up and use it for a kesa or something. So it's textiles are expensive, and all those textiles worn by the courtesans are usually donated by big people who furnish them for the first week of the new year, and then the parade, they do the dochu or something, and show off, and of course there would be the crest of the house and the crest of the guy who gave it or something. So it's instantly new hierarchies. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Of course. Always the Bavarians, yeah.
Genau.
Good.
Yeah, I just one question about, you were using this Moronobu, these pictures at the beginning, and you said that you were using them as spatial clues. And I was wondering whether you could do that, because I don't think you really did. You used it as a narrative clue, like how they approach and how they go in and which rooms they would pass. But because it's not a realistic picture, so the spatial structure of the picture itself would be would represent something else.
Yeah, of course, that's absolutely right.
But you were using it as a narrative clue so far.
No, I highlighted. It's not from my period. It's not from the very. But it's wonderful. It's a wonderful scroll, and it is a cohesive scroll, right? So you have a lot of depictions that fit very well. So the people in front of those kind of window grates and picking their woman, or much more frequently not picking but gazing at the women, they are kind of not in reach of. And the interesting thing about the Moronobu is that you have this one cohesive thing, and they have the kitchen. So this is so palpable. You can put them side by side and show, okay, well, this must have been inhabited by the chefs, and probably swirling around the stuff. And they would have opened the curtain and shown the clients, this is our kitchen. And if you know usual kind of residential kitchens in Japan, they're tiny. And to have something that's a hall on its own, right? Of course, size matters in Japan. So this is that's something, because everything seems so low-rise. We lose aware. Yeah, it's low-rise in a sense. So we come from a skyscraper culture, right? And then, or we come from our cathedrals. So and then you come to Japan, and you're not so impressed by a 2- or 3-story building. But if you know already everything that's beyond 1 story is remarkable, then you see, okay, this is very kind of Prachtbau or something that's really impressive.
But you're right that there's a lot of visual allusions. The kitchen scene is definitely taken from the Shuhandon Emaki, with all the ways that they cut up fish and so forth. So it's definitely not reality, but it builds a nice story, and I think there's a lot of truth in it. I mean, they looked at all kinds of documents that support the idea of how.
And educated people who would have frequented the pleasure districts would have known the models, and then would have seen an actual space that quotes
what
stuff,
they
right?
have in their mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, well, that was my question. Do we have any idea, indication who designed this and who built it and what the models were?
Yeah, and that's a tricky one. So no, because this is commoner art and commoner architects. That's something. So William Colegrave argues that in the 17th century there's this shift to architects. Something, so you have customary practice in the 16th century, and then during the 17th century there comes this creative genius of people who deviate from custom and have a strong opinion, and you have a lot of very unusual, very kind of eccentric or non-traditional buildings in the 17th, 18th century. And to my knowledge, I have no information about commoner architects or designer of architecture. But this is very decidedly a design decision to build something like this. I assume that there would have been the usual back and forth between the persons who ordered this and the person who does drafts, and then the client, the patron would say, okay, I want to have differently. I want to have something that's really, really rare and really unusual. Right? There are other relics of Ageya, also in the Shimabara. There is forget the name, there is one that has one building that has one old room, right? And that's a very typical situation in Japan, since you can dismantle architecture and can incorporate rooms or relics of older buildings into something new. And there is much more fluidity. And the way to find out about dates is usually to do the kaitai shuri, to dismantle the entire thing and to look, okay, there have been alterations, and so this is something else, has different materials, and right, and they didn't dismantle it so far. So we don't know.
Is there any similarity to other types of buildings in Japan, like for example these honjin, these hotels for officials? On Tokai, for example.
Oh,
So Katsura is different. So this is usually seen as one of the prime embodiments of Ageya architecture.
Not aristocratic,
right?
but something.
In many instances, it uses a vocabulary that comes from daimyo mansions, right? Daimyo mansions are their own field because they're influenced by a lot of different things. And then you have, for instance, the facade, and the facade is taken from commoner architecture, blown up to an unbelievably big scale, actually. Right? So it's a synthetical thing, per se.
yeah,
Thank you for your very interesting and stimulating and rich talk. I have a question about the hierarchies within the courtesans. We were talking about the hierarchies within the visitors of the quarters, and then when entering the Sumiya, they would leave their regalia outside and enter as equals. What about courtesans, and which rooms were dedicated to which type of courtesans? Whether there was strict separation, whether we could identify what was which level and...
Again, conjecture. So this is, I just finished my book, and this was a kind of a side project, and this is now what kind of condensed out of 2 years or so. And this will, at some point, I hope, be published, and then maybe kind of provide the basis for something bigger. Spatial othering or so, in 10 years from now. So, good question. Merely conjecture. If you read Ihara Saikaku or so, then you have frequent mentions to a patron renting an entire suite or renting a particularly nice room and hiring particularly high-ranking women. So conjecture would be mid-level high-ranking courtesans. So among the Taiyu and the next ones, and so and also the Taiyu is so the categories shift at sometimes that the Oigan is the highest one, and so also the categories are developing over time. My guess would be that the best rooms go to the best courtesans, and if you are a mid-level courtesan, then you're probably not hired for a very, very rare room. But you're admitted to one of the garden front rooms and would entertain people there. Kyoto's culture being sometimes a little bit snobbish, I would also think that just sometimes, right? So some establishments probably would be highly selective which courtesans they would admit. And this would be premediated, of course, by the patron, by the client, and by the proprietor of the courtesan. So there would be probably is an established relationship between particular Ageya and particular Ageya, I think. The Sumiya is famous in its time. So that's one, you see it on this map that's very prominent in the Ageya-cho. This is the one that's really highlighted. Of course, in the Ageya-cho there are much more, but it's the one that's really prominently spread out as a really remarkable thing. Yeah, go on.
Just a follow-up question or just a continuation of this. The pine tree that you showed in the garden, which type of courtesan would you be able to see from there, for example? Because it becomes a symbol for this, you know, as
So
sign for this?
To be admitted to the chamber of Mother of Pearl, I think would be a distinguished this distinction. The Odashiki, this kind of room of the pine tree, that's one of the big garden front rooms. I would not assume that everybody is guided instantly there, but this is probably where you assemble also bigger crowds. So if you have a big poetry gathering, and those poetic societies can have 50, 60, 70 members or so, then this is probably where you can accommodate all those people. Right? So a lot of guesswork. I'm sorry for that. And, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I have a question whether foreigners will be allowed to enter there later in the 19th century, late 19th century, or nothing, no one at all. It's just because I'm very interested in like, I'm from European art history, so I'm very interested always in influences from
You would have liked
Japan. And I noticed a lot of similarities between the Phoenix room and the Peacock room in Washington. It's like aestheticism, and I just wondered if there was a direct influence maybe.
Yeah. And this phoenix, of course, is a fantasy creature, and these phoenixes are influenced by a lot of different birds. Okay. And it goes back so phoenixes, all birds come up in the Mara. But your question about foreigners being admitted, with the end of the feudal regime, of course, all those places instantly ran out of a big chunk of their clientele. Because, of course, high-ranking samurai went there, but they went there incognito. So, not a daimyo, but a better off vassal. He would kind of rent one of those straw hats and dress down and sneak in or so. And also the rich merchants, so there's a lot of financial kind of warps going on at the end of the Meiji period. And then many of those establishments just struggled, right? And as I mentioned, it was luck in the bad luck for this Sumiya that they found a new kind of body of clients in those right-wing Shinsengumi guys, and later on rightist party members and so on. And many other establishments just lost clients. The pleasure district was abolished, so this kind of grew into the urban sprawl of Kyoto. There is a reinvented entrance gateway. It looks very different from the original one. So the original one has those two pylons, and now it's a Yotsu Ashimon, so it's a very kind of generic entrance gateway, but they have a willow tree, right? So there is still a willow tree. And there are a couple of establishments still in Shimabara. It is.
Everybody's sweating away. Okay, last question.
Last question.
So I just want to ask, have you seen any kind of materials in that period criticizing the relationship between the clients and courtesans?
Not to my knowledge, no. As I mentioned, entertaining prostitutes and everything that's problematic for Westerners is not part of traditional Japanese culture. So it's not that if you are a prostitute, then you are a fallen woman. You are a poor woman because you spoil your karmic rebirth and you have to sell yourself to all those men. But in Japan there is not this kind of sin thinking that we have in the West. So there is a lot of criticizing of from the government of the rich townspeople, of the rich merchants, of living beyond their standing. There is also criticism of spending all this money for nothing, and people starve on the streets because the historical reality looked very different. There are people starving in Japan, of course. In ukiyo literature, of course, this is glorified. So Yonosuke, right? The thousandfold lover, he entertains 20 high-ranking courtesans at the same time and has to call in women from Osaka or women from Kyoto at the same time. So, and of course, this is something that's so impressive because he just burns this money. This is lighting your cigarette with $1,000 bills, of course. So this is this. You always have to distinguish between something that can be reconstructed, because something that's obviously a fiction in the period, and then a government stance, and the government, of course, is always interested in containing and controlling, and yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this enriching Q&A as well, as your wonderful talk.
I don't know if I answered too much, but
yeah. We had a great, it was interesting.